By gifting a laptop to a resident or donating, you can help those who need help the most. Search Windows for Opportunity on GoFundMe or find out more at recruitrefugees.ie.
Football on Off the Ball.
With Paddy Power. Champions League nights on Off the Ball. Bigger than Zlatan's Eco. Gamble responsibly. Gamblingcare.ie.
Now we'll come to Real Madrid Liverpool in a few moments' time. Jota starts. If you've just tuned in, is the team news from a Liverpool perspective. Firmino is on the bench. They have a midfield with Thiago also on the bench. Keita, Wijnaldum and Fabinho start. As for Man City against Dortmund, that's where we'll begin with Miguel Delaney of the London Independent. How you doing, Miguel?
Not too bad, thanks. Not too bad.
Not a bad evening ahead. I think this is a decent lineup.
Absolutely. Just a pity they're on at the same time.
I know. So, Man City team news, Walker, Stones, Diaz, Cancelo as the back four, Rodri and Gundogan as a two, and then we have Mahrez, De Bruyne, Foden with Bernardo Silva as a false nine. It is always striking when you see a Sterling and an Aguero in particular on the bench. Anything about this team catch you by surprise? Guardiola, Champions League knockout stages can throw curveballs, good and bad.
Well, that's exactly. I mean, I suppose Aguero isn't so much of a surprise anymore. Sterling is. But then again, maybe it's not a surprise, as you say, given the context with Guardiola. And I suppose I was thinking about this in terms of kind of his previous seasons, and especially how well they've been doing in the league. In that almost seems irrelevant with Guardiola because, and sometimes maybe it's counterproductive because when City are doing well in the league, it's almost like he tries to stave off his kind of complacency or sense of security by doing something different to kind of recharge him. And sometimes it has an adverse effect. Now, the one thing about that is, I mean, the quality of Haaland notwithstanding, it does feel like Dortmund have been really bad this season. And I mean, what City trashed Borussia Mönchengladbach in the last 16, really that's about Dortmund's level right now. And unless it is that the kind of the stage of the game and the fact that he hasn't yet been beyond the quarterfinals with City gets to them, or Haaland maybe does something ridiculous, then really this should be a pretty forgiving win for City, which is why I'm on Liverpool Madrid.
It's an interesting point you make that you think Guardiola mixes things up on Champions League evenings almost to recharge the team. I feel he indulges more in neuroticism. I think the playing group are incredibly motivated and don't need much of a recharging for a big knockout Champions League night. I think Pep almost feels that the bigger occasion requires a little extra frisson of his genius somehow.
Well, I think it's both. And I mean, there's probably a lot in this, really, because you probably have to remember with Guardiola that this was a guy that, I mean, there's always that famous photo of him, you know, as a 14-year-old ball boy the night that Barca came from 3-0 down against Gothenburg. But of course, what's often forgotten about that, or what's never added, is that in the very next round, in the final against Sevilla, Barca had one of their classic, their own neurotic moments in the Champions League and lost to Steaua Bucharest in the final. And at that point had never won it. Whereas this was the competition that Real Madrid were always associated with. So, like, I do think that feeds into a lot of this with Pep Guardiola, that he would have grown up with the Champions League as very much Madrid's competition that was, you know, frustratingly elusive and almost agonisingly elusive for Barcelona. And that's probably been fostered for him personally as well over the last decade because he hasn't added to it in the way many expected after winning it with and the thing is, even with that Barcelona team, they won it twice in absolutely brilliant fashion. But really, they should have won it 4 times in a row and didn't because of two of the most kind of like incredible semi-finals. And it always feels like, especially Guardiola, who's a manager, so obsessed with control. But obviously, the Champions League is a knockout competition. It has this element of randomness that it's almost like scrambles his brain a little bit sometimes.
Really interesting piece for the London Independent this week. People should check it out on the website. In effect, I think you sat down and watched all of Haaland's 104 goals. And you do point out in the piece, by the way, be under no illusion, he is very much Man City's number one target. What jumped out to you of the 104 goals in particular is that in amongst them, 30 tap-ins, headers inside the area as well. I think there were 4 of them. So effectively a third of his goals are tap-ins, the kind of goals we might associate with Man City when they make Premier League matches look like 5-a-side games. So the point was almost this guy's a more complete player than we might think, because the highlights reel is 6'4" Haaland bustling people out of the way and making fellow players look lacking in strength and as if he's some kind of ringer going about his business. And it was doubly interesting when you explain that, given his upbringing, that really with Haaland the craft came before the size.
Yeah, certainly. I spoke to some of his coaches when he was young at Bryn. I hope I pronounced that right. But yeah, I mean, like the first time I ever saw him live, actually to date, the only time I've seen him live was in the first leg against Paris Saint-Germain last year. It was one of the last games I did just before lockdown, actually. Seems a very different world to be travelling abroad for big European nights. But in that game, he scored that amazing goal where he ran with the ball about 40 yards, like it was an Olympic sprint, before smashing it into the top corner from 25 yards. And like, given his size and what you talk about in terms of kind of, it almost feels like he's like an older boy playing with smaller kids, or almost like a Jonah Lomu of football. You would almost associate him. When you think of Haaland, you think of that power. But the reality is actually, I mean, he has that, but he also has a real kind of Aguero-like stealth. And the way it was put to me, or from, I suppose, the conclusion from the way it was explained was that he was basically a nimble kid who because he was so good and he was young, he often played a year or two ahead of him. And that meant he was playing against bigger boys. So he had to learn how to kind of outthink them, or kind of, time his runs in a different way. And that's, I think, where a lot of this comes from. But of course, then he was a nimble forward who grew into this absolute powerhouse. So he has this considerable range, and arguably almost the complete modern forward in that way.
Yeah. Of his 104 goals, 30 were tap-ins, first time finish to beat the keeper 27, penalties 9, rounded the keeper 7 times, outside the box 6, headers 7, and controlled finish to beat keeper 18. I wanted to ask you about the last one. What's a controlled finish to beat keeper? So that's where he's placing it, kind of Thierry Henry style, is it?
Yeah, I suppose to distinguish it from kind of a first-time touch to beat the keeper. It's a lot of those where he kind of takes a touch to steady himself, or sometimes when he's clean through. But basically, when he has the ball under control to finish it. And obviously that does lead to kind of a wide range of finishes. I mean, for one of those, I think he chipped it elegantly. For another, he scored like a classic where he just slides it under the keeper. But yeah, I mean, he's got a kind of the full range of finishes in his lock.
Raiola's tour of Spain was very eye-catching, deliberately so, you would think. I mean, if ever a guy was trying to make everyone jealous, that was it. So where are City on Haaland? You say, be under no illusion, he is the number one target.
So, yeah, I mean, absolutely, that's the case. And everyone you speak to in England basically says that City think they have him, or at least kind of have something in place which, makes them very confident. I don't think wages or anything like that have been agreed. And a lot of people in England think that the purpose of this European tour of Spain, Raiola and the two Spanish giants, was basically to drive to drive City's offer up and show to show that they've got a bit of competition. But I actually think the competition is maybe more alive than people in England realise. I mean, a lot of people who speak to in England, they think he's only going to City and nowhere else. I actually think he'll end up in Spain. I think we discussed this on the show before, I think, but from talking to people close to him, it was put to me that, I mean, almost because of that size, and they've been conscious that he does pick up a few kind of minor muscle injuries. His brother had to give up football earlier. But they basically, they want, and he studied Cristiano Ronaldo a lot as well. Haaland, his father, Raiola, and all the people around him, they see him as being capable of a career well into his 30s, like Ronaldo in that sense. And I think, I mean, in contrast to Ronaldo, they think that maybe it means the best option now, while he's still developing, is that he should go to Spain, because because if you're at one of the big two in Spain, it's a more forgiving league than the Premier League. And certainly the schedule isn't as intense, for one thing, so they feel that could be that could prolong his career. But there are a few caveats to that, because the Spanish tour obviously have such a more difficult financial situation, and if Dortmund don't make the Champions League, which does seem very likely at this point, maybe England or Man City will represent the more obvious offer.
Yeah, well, I mean, finances, where you took the words out of my mouth when it came to Madrid and Barcelona, and Dortmund are looking for 150 million euros. I mean, nobody's going to pay 150 million euros, I would think. Even City might balk at that. And then in Spain, tax changes there means the wages are more problematic for the Spanish clubs to come up with as well.
Oh yeah, I mean, like, I don't think there'd be too many, violins taken over this, but the Spanish giants have probably suffered more than most in football, relatively speaking, because of the position they were in and just the effect of the COVID crisis. And Madrid even made the mistake of taking the decision to expand their stadium just as the crisis hit. As you say, the tax rate's gone up. Currently, and one of the main reasons we're seeing so much about a potential Super League or really changes to the Champions League is because the Spanish 2 or really the Spanish 3 with Atletico, they want to increase their revenue streams because they don't think they can compete. They fear they're being left behind by this kind of new football world and especially the influence of money from the Middle East, which they don't have access to in the same way because they're member-owned clubs. Now, I would think that's a good thing, even if it can lead to it's not necessarily flawless with some of the kind of presidential regimes we've seen in the Big Two, but at least it still puts the clubs in the hands of their members rather than kind of ownerships with other motivations or other objectives. But for the current hierarchies, they just see a lot of money being pumped into Paris Saint-Germain, maybe not pumped in, but these kind of super fortified teams that they don't have.
Real Madrid, Liverpool, Miguel, 3rd in La Liga versus 7th in the Premier League. Madrid have El Clasico on Saturday as well before return leg at Anfield. Varane, COVID positive test. He'd been rested at the weekend for this game given the absence of Ramos. So suddenly Militao and Nacho in the centre of that Madrid defence looks a bit more vulnerable than it might have. Jota starts for Liverpool. It was hard to leave him out, near impossible to leave him out at the moment.
Yeah, I was at Arsenal on Saturday, and it was just, I suppose there's his general directness, which is so striking, literally, and so different compared to what they've got. But and also, really, there's at the moment, given the form he's on, he's almost a guarantee of goals. So yeah, I don't think you can leave him out, especially given some of the issues Liverpool have had this season. But then it does have that feel already. I mean, obviously their form is picked up domestically, but it does have that feel as if it's going to be one of those campaigns where they're a classic case of one of those teams looking completely different in Europe than they have done for most of their domestic season. Just the effect the Champions League has in that way.
Yeah. The Madrid team has Benzema leading the line. Asensio is there. Vinicius Jr. They have Kroos. They have Casemiro. They have Modric. Like a lot of big names. So where are they? I have to say, I think it's probably the weakest Madrid, even allowing for those names. Because remember, these are names that have been there. They're at the end of a cycle, really. Yeah.
This is kind of the dregs of that Champions League winning era. And players that are, if not past their best, maybe could have done with a refresh. Is something a bit different. And I do think this is the weakest Madrid since 2009 when Liverpool thrashed them 4-0. And it basically prompted that remarkable summer when they bought Ronaldo, Benzema and Kaká. And I have to say, if it wasn't for Liverpool's own season, the issues they had, I would think this is going to be a pretty comfortable qualification for Liverpool.
So no Thiago in midfield. They've gone for Keita, they've gone for Fabinho, Wijnaldum. A lot of legs there. Yeah,
it feels like they've gone for energy rather than control in this game. And I suppose they can feel they can put this Madrid defence under considerable pressure. Madrid midfield and defence.
What did you make of them against Arsenal? Because the general analysis has focused on how worryingly bad Arsenal were. Liverpool looked to my eye to be pretty decent, and as you said, Klopp has kind of tried to almost reframe this final portion of the season. Suddenly Champions League is within 3 points again after us thinking it was gone, and here we are in the Champions League knockout stages. Juices are flowing. There's a familiarity to the back four, if not quite total trust in it, but at least there's familiarity to it again, and Fabinho's back in midfield. There's kind of a cautious sense that they might be able to string a bit of form together now.
Yeah, I felt the opposite about Saturday. I know Arsenal were very bad, but I think it was just one of those bad performances that happened when they're a team in transition. They had a lot of injuries, and also now their focus is very much on Europe because they see that as the most obvious route back into the Champions League if they win the Europa League. So from that perspective, I thought this performance was more like the Arsenal side was just one of those things that happens. Whereas I thought Liverpool were almost as good as I've seen them this season, and it was probably their best performance since the 7-0 win over Crystal Palace. I think that has a lot to do with, I mean, obviously there was Jota, who basically just gives them goals, but also Fabinho was in midfield, which meant they could just function more like the Liverpool that we know.
Really interesting chat about Alexander-Arnold on Monday Night Football, and Neville Carragher to a lesser extent, I think, but I think Carragher signed off by saying, if you pick Trippier over Alexander-Arnold, that's embarrassing, I think was the end of the segment. But Neville was pretty concrete in his view that Southgate leaving Alexander-Arnold out of the most recent international break is very much a precursor to leaving him out of the Euros, and he's softening the ground for that bombshell. Basically, he was saying Alexander-Arnold, other teams look at him and they say there is space in behind that guy, and what he gives you going forward does not compensate enough for what he doesn't give you going backwards. What do you make of him when you're watching this, like, God, genius footballer go about his stuff in front of your eyes at the Emirates, for instance? Are you seeing those flaws that Neville's talking about?
Not to the same degree. I do think Trent Alexander-Arnold is pretty much the most talented, or one of the most talented players England have got. Okay, maybe he's not as strong defensively, but then I think that almost reflects kind of one of the big issues with this, which is basically that in the club game, fullbacks aren't really used in that way. They're basically attacking players, whereas Southgate doesn't really see them like that. He sees them as much more traditional fullbacks, and that's why I think Neville does actually have a point, because I mean, for to be the Trent Alexander that is the brilliant Liverpool Trent Alexander, it almost has to be in the same position, not in a more withdrawn fullback. Right? He has to be a wing back really, or even also a winger. Whereas that's not how Southgate's going to use him. And if he's not going to use him like that, it's almost a bit of a waste. Now, of course, I think Alexander-Arnold should be in the squad, but the logic of Southgate is basically that Trippier and Walker are more comfortable performing the role he wants. And the international game is different from the club game in that way. It's almost branching off. Yeah,
it was interesting. Even Neville emphasised these are like one-off cup matches. There is a pragmatism involved here, as opposed to flowing football across the course of a season, maybe, and flowing moves, which was kind of part of his thinking. By the way, somebody's texted in. Can you ask Miguel, are all these Haaland goals available in one neat YouTube video?
I feel I shouldn't broadcast anything that maybe goes against copyright, but if you look, you can find it. Okay. That's a nice afternoon. Anything hit you? Like, I guess you must spot patterns of movement or little moves he likes to make, or little areas, between a fullback or a centre half he likes to pick up. These kind of things emerge, because I suspect the Man City research team behind Guardiola have been looking for similar themes or similar patterns. The word. Well, it was striking. First of all, it is amazing how it's not even that he scores tap-in so often. It's almost how often he scores the same type of tap-in, where he is. He's basically 2 yards from goal, beside the post, sometimes reaching for the bit just to poke it in, or sometimes just literally just to tap it. But if you watch the bit before that, of course, all these identical goals come from very different type of runs, and I think that's the real difficulty for him, or for anyone trying to defend against him, which is that he's impossible to pick up. I suppose to anyone else, or to people from the outside, it looks like he has this instinct for it, this kind of this sixth sense for goal. But I suppose it comes from highly crafted runs and a real kind of innate football intelligence there.
Yeah, it's all very interesting. If he'd had the growth spurt early on, we mightn't have the player we have now. So what do you reckon tonight then? 2 games?
I think 2 relatively comfortable English wins.
Okay. Miguel Delaney, as ever, much appreciated. Thanks, Miguel.
Thank you. Cheers, Joe.
Miguel Delaney there from the London Independent. That piece well worth checking out on the Independent website if you're interested. Football on Off the Ball is with thanks to Paddy Power. For information on responsible gambling, visit gamblingcare.ie.
Football on Off the Ball
with Paddy Power. Champions League nights on Off the Ball. Bigger than Zlatan's ego. Gamble responsibly. Gamblingcare.ie. What does the future of our country look like? Is the staycation here to stay? Will online shopping replace the high street for good? What about a 4-day working week? In a new series on News Talk, we're looking at how we can reimagine Ireland in some of the most important facets of Irish life. Follow the series and have your say on News Talk.
If I learned one thing in the last year, it's that falling into debt can happen to anyone. Luckily, I heard about the ISI, the Insolvency Service of Ireland. Their professional advisors can help you restructure or even write off your debt. The first thing they said to me was every debt problem has a solution.